Today, I'd like to introduce John Hickman, who's going to talk us about the prolific sporting art printmakers Charles and George Hunt from the 19th century. As far as I can tell, John ran two parallel careers. One was as a property developer following his qualification as a chartered surveyor. The other was to record and collect as many prints produced by his great-great-great-grandfather, Charles Hunt, simply because John had spare and empty walls in his flat. This has ended up with a magisterial book, a catalogue raisonné of their work, very heavy, which John published in 2017, but John is going to tell us more. As usual, John will be happy, as Sally said, to answer questions at the end of the talk. The procedure is that you use the Q&A button at the bottom right of the screen, you type the question, and I put the questions to John. I'll also add my own questions. So, John, over to you.
Well, thank you, Tim. I'm John Hickman, and I'm flattered to have been asked by the British Sporting Art Trust to talk about two of the most important engravers of sporting prints in the 19th century, namely Charles and George Hunt. Important because not only were they two of the finest of their craft, but also the most prolific, as Tim has said. Charles Hunt was my great-great-grandfather, but also, as Tim says, my great-great-great-grandfather. George Hunt was Charles's first cousin. The story begins 60 years ago when I bought my first flat, which had several bare walls that needed some pictures. Not knowing where to begin, I wondered whether it might be possible to track down a few Charles Hunt prints. And so I made inquiries of Sotheby's. Ah, they said, you should subscribe to our sporting print sales catalogues. And so I did. And whilst I was about it, Christie's, Bonhams and Phillips as well. Catalogues poured in, and before long I came across Alfred Gates of Ackermann's, who had had the audacity to outbid me for a set of 4 Charles Hunts. I followed him back to his gallery, all of 40 yards away, and we did a deal, which included the Queen of Trumps, the original oil of which by John Herring I saw years later when I spent 3 days of research in the former home of Paul Mellon, the Brick House, in the 1980s. Alfred Gates became a very helpful friend, and I asked him one day why it was that print enthusiasts only ever referred to Sulzer as their Bible, knowing that there were very many prints that were not listed and that some were described incorrectly. He responded immediately by saying that that was all that existed. And as far as Charles and George Hunt prints were concerned, there was a reference book to be written, and that I was best placed to write it. Anyway, more on that later. The Hunt family, engraving and printing was in their blood. It seems curious to me that 2 brothers and a cousin should all decide to go into engraving at about the same time without having acquired their skill from a previous generation. Now, I can't prove it, but I suspect that a Joseph Hunt, who began making playing cards in the 1790s, and his 2 sons, John, William and George, continued to do so, and were all very close relatives. For the record, all 3 became masters of the Worshipful Company of Makers of Playing Cards, so they were pretty skillful. What is certain is that Charles Hunt, George Hunt, Francis Charles Hunt, Thomas Hunt, Frederick Augustus Hunt, Charles Hunt Jr., Edwin Henry Hunt, Thomas Hunt, and Sidney Hunt were all engravers and all related. What is also certain is that Charles Hunt, the 19th century painter of romantic scenes, 1829 to 1900, was no relation of our Charles Hunt, senior or junior. Appallingly, many publications and most of the auction houses confused the two, attributing his dates 1803 to 1877, which belonged to our Charles Hunt. It is amazing to me that no one had ever carried out the research to differentiate the two before I did. After all, their styles are completely different, and I'm an amateur. And just for the record, Charles Hunt, the painter, lived in Chelsea, Kensington, and before settling in Wandsworth. Charles Hunt, the engraver, lived in Lambeth and Covent Garden before settling in Clerkenwell. The painter was the father of Reuben, Walter, Claude, and Edgar, very fine Royal Academy exhibitors, whereas engravers were prohibited from being members of the RA, however brilliant they were. And so to the lives of George and Charles Hunt. George Hunt was born in Lambeth in about 1798-99, but we cannot be certain. However, we can say with certainty that George married Charlotte Parker at St. Pancras Old Church on Monday, the 3rd of April, 1820. Witnesses to the union were Edward Hunt, probably a brother, and S.J. Fuller. And S.J. Fuller, of course, were important print sellers and stationers in their Temple of Fancy at 34 Rathbone Place, crucial players in the world of sporting art and prints. Indeed, George Hunt started engraving for S.J. Fuller for their publication Flights of Fancy, published on the 1st of May, 1821. At some point in 1822, George established a publishing business with Henry Pyle, a set of seaside prints, Brighton Chain Pier, Dover Pier, Margate Pier, and Ramsgate Pier, dated 1824, tell us that Pyle and Hunt were based at 6 York Street, corner of Bridges Street, Covent Garden, and moved to 18 Tavistock Street the same year. During this period in partnership with Pyle, but with Charles working alongside him, George was very productive, publishing comic and topographical books, as well as a wide range of sporting and hunting prints. Imprints from this period give the publisher as either George Hunt, Pyle and Hunt, Charles Hunt, and even Hunt and Pyle. But on the 9th of April, 1825, the London Gazette gave notice that the business was to be dissolved. However, it was made clear that Charles was permitted to continue alone. But alas, 3 years later, in February 1828, George was insolvent and in a debtor's prison in Whitecross Street. George seems to have been prolific for 5 years, up until 1828, when production tailed off and engravings were carried out by Charles and George jointly until 1836. His last works were 4 engravings in 1843, and one of his last was Arnell. A death certificate cannot be traced for certain, but he was still alive in 1871, aged 72, and I estimate he engraved well over 400 plates in his life. Charles Hunt was born in Lambeth in 1803 to Charles and Mary née Buller. Little is known about him as a young man, but he married Elizabeth Bryan, née Parker, the sister of George's wife, Charlotte, in St. Saviour's, Southwark, on the 20th of September, 1824. They had 9 children and lived at 24 Bridges Street, Covent Garden, then Broad Court off Bow Street, Phoenix Street, roughly where the British Library is today, and finally 13 Theobalds Road, Clerkenwell. He joined his cousin George Hunt in about 1825, working at 18 Tavistock Street, but life as an engraver was precarious, and he too found himself in a debtor's prison in 1840-41. How on earth one was able to pay off debts when one was prevented from working beats me, or was one, as we shall see later. And of course, Charles Dickens was to champion the reversal of this aspect of the law. Anyway, these inconveniences never seemed to affect either Charles's production or the fine quality of his work. He was prolific from 1830 to 1842, producing a handful of engravings until 1857, when he was joined by his son Charles, with whom he worked, producing one or two a year until his death in 1877. I estimate he produced about 700 engravings in his productive life of 50 years, dying at the age of 74. At the peak of his career, he took over engraving from John F. Herring's Derby Winners after Thomas Sutherland died. So he was regarded as the finest engraver of the day, or the most competitive. I must mention Charles Hunt's children. Of his 9 children, 3 tried their hand at engraving: Frederick Augustus, Charles, and Edwin Henry. Whereas Charles Jr. became fairly proficient engraving horses, producing 39 plates with his father, Edwin engraved greyhounds and winners of the Waterloo Cup, which were fairly uninspiring. However, the one and only engraving by Frederick Augustus is of Members in Affix, published on the 7th of August, 1853. Frederick was basically a fruiterer, and no surprise living in Covent Garden. But he too spent time in a debtor's prison in 1859 to 61. After he married Marion Cox, he lived above Cox's library, 78 Drury Lane, which is where my grandmother was born, neatly linking the known with the unknown. And so to the work of Charles and George Hunt. It is, of course, difficult to know where to begin. However, I have selected a few images showing how varied their subjects were. But before I launch into this, I need to say that with the popularity of hunting and racing, with the ever-increasing middle class, who wanted images of their interests on their walls, and being unable to afford oil paintings, they were happy to make do with paint prints. As we all know, there is a long history of printing images after well-known artists, and indeed their own right. So sporting prints naturally evolved to meet this rising demand. I'm always delighted to see a Charles or George Hunt print in a pub, or in a French or German hotel, or even used on placemats. And their work is certainly not confined to Europe, for I have seen Hunts in the USA, South Africa, and Australia. The earliest known work of George Hunt is 48 hand-colored humorous prints for S&J Fuller's publication, as I mentioned, The Flight of Fancy. This was followed by humorous designs on the 1st of November, 1824, 5 images, one of which, A Helping Hand, rather amuses me. And it reads, "John, I'm going to raise your rent." "Sir, I'm very much obliged to you, for I can't raise it myself." In 1825, he was unbelievably productive with Matrimonial Ladder on the 1st of January, published by Hunt and Pyle, 18 Tavistock Street, the same address again, Covent Garden, originally with 16 plates, expanded to 20 and then 23. Then followed another slim book, Airy Nothings, consisting of 23 more elaborately engraved sketches published by Pyle and Hunt on the 1st of February, 1825. Here and There Over the Water followed, with 27 even better developed sketches published by Pyle and Hunt on the 1st of April, 1825, more or less at the same time as Ola Podrida, the last of these little books. But Colensino Furioso, with 15 images, was published in July 1825 by Hunt alone, Pyle, of course, having departed in April. 118 engravings in total in 1 year. He excelled in coaching prints, as well as hunting and portraits of horses. And scenery. New Life Pier Cheney Walk, I'm showing this because it's so rare, you'll never see it in any publication except in my book. and caricatures. A spanking dog day and a glorious day. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and the same to you, sir. A real rubber. A New Year's morning. Splendid, aren't they? And finally, shooting with fabulous scenery. So his work was enormously varied, as well as fun and beautiful. The work of Charles Hunt really is impossible to cover in such a short exposition. As I've said above, I estimate Charles engraved about 700 images. His most prolific period between 1829 and 1838, i.e. from his mid-20s to his mid-30s. In addition to dozens of horse portraits, Charles engraved a host of racing prints after Campion, Cooper, Herring, Turner, Harry Hall, Shea, and others, as well as coaching prints, after Pollard, not to mention numerous caricatures after Theodore Lane and Joe Lyle, as well as those after Clay's dubious Tregear's Black Jokes and Life in Philadelphia. To be precise, he engraved 29 plates after Henry Alken, 21 after Harry Hall, 38 after Turner, 55 after Pollard, 83 after Herring, and 78 after his own. Very crudely indeed, in the 1830s, he was producing 2 plates a month. And when he was in a debtor's prison in 1840-41, he seems to have been doing 1 a week. So as I say, perhaps one was allowed to work in a debtor's prison. And so to some illustrations. Racing, here at the start of the Derby. That's the Hippodrome, Kensington. And finally, a lovely one, dead heat between Charles and Euclid. Coaching, here's the Kershaw coach. The Kew Bridge, as you see, that building's still there actually, even if the bridge has changed a little. And hunting. And I put this one in. It's not particularly glamorous, but it certainly gets the idea that it was early in the morning, doesn't it? Hunting. Here we have a fine image, I think. That's a very rare one. And so is that. And horse portraits. Caroline, Forrester. I've included this one here because you see Running Rein and the Princess, which became Orlando and the Princess. And after the change of winner that was declared, note the jockey's change of position too. And scenery. He did many scenery. There were, of course, many other engravers of sporting prints, and I should mention Sutherland, Reeve, Duncan, Harris, Havel, Rosenberg, Samuel Alken, Bentley, Duberg, Clark, Smart, and Summers. They were all superb, and Charles worked in collaboration with a few of them. In short, he was a remarkably productive artist, as well as a very gifted, and was surely one of the finest engravers ever to have lived. I've been asked to mention the value of prints, which of course is dependent upon originality, quality, and rarity, not to mention fashion, i.e. the demand for sporting prints. I used to have a rule of thumb, namely an original publication in good condition was worth £1,500, a late reprint £150, and something printed last week 15 quid. However, life isn't so simple, and for example, with the set of the 6 Niagaras, I found myself the underbidder at a Christie's sale at £30,000. The problem for me was that Niagara Falls does stand on the boundary of 2 reasonably wealthy countries. But Niagara is exceptional, and most prints can be bought for a few £100s. I'm not really really looking now, but I do buy occasionally prints that I don't have. And my impression is that prints of this nature are no longer coming on the market, which neatly brings me to my own collection, which I built up over 50 years. In the process, I've met some really charming and helpful people: the late Alfred Gates, David Fuller, Stephen Miles, George Wellham, John Sabin, Nigel and Henry Talbot, the late Norman Blackburn, Nicholas Price, Julian Armitage, the late Andrew Edmonds, David Isaacs, and the list goes on. I guess I have about 95% of everything that Charles and George produced, and in the process of collecting, I couldn't resist upgrading from time to time. I'll give you two examples. The first is Goodwood by Charles Hunt after F.C. Turner. I had a copy and bought a far better one. I gave the poorer quality print to a print dealer in Arundel, and within 3 days he'd sold it. I remarked how quickly he had effected a sale. He said, "Oh, it was easy. I phoned Goodwood, and they said they didn't have one." Hookwood Common by Charles Hunt after Share. Again, I had a copy, but saw another with much subtler colours in Grosvenor prints. I thought, I'm not paying £1,500 simply for a prettier picture, until I noticed the different name of the publisher. So I am afraid I paid £715 part exchange for an earlier publisher, namely Soft, but it's a prettier picture. I think I can't make this presentation about the family, Hunt family of engravers without including two others, namely F.C. Hunt, clearly a contemporary of Charles and George and possibly a younger brother of one of them. However, he produced 12 known and hugely varied engravings published by Harrison Isaacs, Charles Square, Soho, in the mid to late 1820s. You see how varied they are. This one here was done for a school, for teach kids mathematics in some fashion. Actually, more geometry than mathematics. Anyway, there we go. And that one I rather like too. The other is Thomas Hunt, who we believe to be the uncle of Charles and George, who together with George produced respectively 7 and 8 fabulous engravings after Lieutenant Chamberlain, R.A., for views and costumes of the city and neighborhood of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, an extremely rare and valuable book published by Thomas Maclean in 1822. And finally, may I be allowed to mention my book? As I have said above, I was inspired to take up the challenge given me by Alfred Gates to write the definitive reference book on the Hunts, because Frank Siltz's book only mentions a fraction of the work of Charles and George, and in some instances he is incorrect. So I started 45 years ago with the help of Hugh Tempest Bradford, who you see on the left here. Oh, sorry, he's on the right. I don't know what you're, and we published a 650-page tome in 2017. Suffice it to say that Nicholas Price described the book as a once-in-a-decade publication, with a 9-page introduction by the greatest living authority on sporting prints, namely John Sabin. I was off to a head start. But the years of research by Moira Mumford and Helen Robertson, who was also the most brilliant and industrious editor, pulled together by Alex Young in his delightfully articulate biographies, has produced a tome with which anyone would be proud to be associated. The images, of course, are what the book is all about, and Hugh wanted no more than 50 illustrations, whereas I wanted 800. So we compromised at 500. At the book launch in the Museum of London Transport, which backs onto, wait for it, 18 Tavistock Street. We sold 150 copies, a record for Unicorn Press. I do have a few left, and I would like them to go to those who will appreciate a copy. If you're interested, please be in contact with the BSAT. To conclude, I'd like to thank you, Christopher Davenport-Jones, I'm sure you're listening, of the BSAT, for suggesting that I give this lecture. It has made me delve into, once again, the amazing work of the Hunts, and in so doing made me appreciate all the more the beauty and the skill of their craft. Thank you. I'd also like to mention my daughter Spider, who's put together these images together with my blurb. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I know it's been a challenge putting together the talk with the new technology, but thank you. Everything worked well. And it was good to see all the pictures that you've been able to find and put on screen.
Thank you.
Number of questions. One of them, Nicholas Price is one of your, you mentioned him in your talk, and obviously close links with Nick.
Yes.
In buying and selling of these prints. He asks about the precarious commercial position of the Hunts and the engraving business in the 19th century. Do you have any records of the price that was being sold, the works were being sold for? And can I add a bit to that question is, how many prints did they print of each subject? Do you have any idea of that?
Well, a very fair question. There is an advertisement that I've got, and they mention a few shillings for prints. I mean, I think that engravers, like a lot of artists in the last century, I mean, died penniless, and it's only years later that their art is appreciated. And I'm thinking of the French Impressionists, whose paintings there were worth millions, and of course they never saw any of it. As for how many they produced, I think it's fair to say that they produced. This is purely speculative, but I mean, I think copper plates didn't last forever, so they were limited by the relatively soft metal, and hence steel engraving came in later on. But I suspect that they probably, as I say, this is pure speculation, maybe 100. I think the owners who commissioned the engravers to make their engravings after, for example, Herring had done the oil, because they wanted to sort of hand them around to friends and those who were involved in their stables. But again, it's purely speculative. I mean, 50, 100 maybe each, but then I think the plates will begin to wear out.
Right. Nick follows up. Did the engraver, again linked to commercial aspects of the job, did the engraver buy the materials up front, the inks, the plates, and so on? And also, were the studio assistants, or was all this work being done personally by Charles and George or the other named Hunts?
Well, it's very good. I mean, I think that 1 year where I said they produced 118, or one of them produced 118 images in 1 year, I mean, they must have had assistants, and I suppose why not? But then you think, well, hang on a moment, did they do the figures or the landscape? Or, I mean, some of these things, I mean, it's all beautiful. Yeah, there's no sort of amateur looking corners in some of these prints. It's difficult to judge, but then I suppose why not? There may have been, as you might expect, those who are good at face images, and those who are good at landscapes, and maybe there were others in the workshop. I should have thought they would have bought their own materials, their own plates, and so they could get away with it, or get on with it, I should say. Yeah.
Are you aware of the relationship between the engraver and the artist? Is it a close relationship? Is it a contractual relationship, or is it just something that you take a picture and you do the job?
Well, I think it's a jolly good question. I suspect it's a bit of both. But I can't believe that somebody like Charles Hunt, who did so many of Herring's, for example, I mean, they must have bumped into each other and discussed their work. And I suppose it's like musicians in an orchestra. I mean, if you're making the same thing, you're bound to sort of talk away, and you become, a bit of friendship evolves. Having said that, I have met a descendant of Herring, and I was so keen. I thought, wow, I'm going to see the original letters and so on that were actually written by Charles Hunt, because he would have those, whereas our chap should have the Herring ones. But no, he said, I know nothing about this. You should speak to my father, which I did. And he said, oh, I'm not interested at all. So, I mean, oh, what an opportunity.
So close, so close.
Oh, you missed.
There's a question from Sophie Hill that's linked. Did the engraver have to have the approval of the original artist to publish the print? Or did they just go ahead and publish come what may?
Well, I wonder. I suspect that they were contracted to make the engravings by the owners of the horse. And I would have thought that it was more to do with this is purely speculation, it's the owner of the horse rather than the owner of the oil painting that had the say. That's my speculation.
The questions are coming in. Did the studio assistants colour the prints, or?
Oh yes,
they are individually coloured, are they?
Yes. Well, famously, the Huguenots, when they came over, apparently they were great colourists, and you would have a few of them sitting around a table, and I'd have blue, and you'd have red, and he'd have yellow, and so on and so forth, and they'd do their bit and pass it on, and then of course hang it out to dry. So I think, yes, all that was done in the studio, but very often, I mean, the one we're looking at the present moment, that was printed in black and blue sky. The blue sky, you noticed, that was not coloured as such, not hand coloured. So I mean, some of them were printed in black and white. Well, they're all printed in black and white, or should all printed black. And then some were hand coloured.
Here's a question about rarity. The numbers you quote as to the number of prints that might have been produced seem to me relatively low. How can you tell a print is rare? What defines rarity?
Very good question. Very good question. It's a very
price.
It's a bit like, what's a rare bird? People say, oh, that's a very rare bird. Oh, yeah. Anyway, simply that in my 50 years, it's what I've seen. Some prints you see quite a lot of, and some you just never ever see another one. And I remember, I mean, the one that we're looking at the present moment, I hope it's still on screen, the self-portrait of Charles Hunt. When I went to an Ackerman exhibition, dear old Alfred Gates said, I've got something for you. So we went downstairs to his office, and on his desk was this thing. And he said, you've seen this before? I said, no. He said, nor have I. In all the years I've been in the business, I've never seen this before. And what I spotted, I don't know whether he did as well, was that self-portrait. And it's the only self-portrait there is of Charles Hunt. It has to be him, because underneath it, it's got drawn and engraved by Charles Hunt. And there is a chap waving a book with horse. I mean, that has to be Charles Hunt. And given that he and I share something, there's a possibility, isn't there? Yeah, it's just a question of and others. I mean, every now and again, for instance, the one I showed you of Cheney Walk, I got a phone call from Nigel Talbot. He said, I've got something that is in no book that I can find. Come and have a look at it. And He said, have you seen this before? No. He said, I've never seen it before. And then I also showed you some other ones. Remember, some back a bit, I showed you one or two hunting ones by Charles Hunt. Again, you won't see those because whoever sold them to me said, I've never seen these before. So some of them just not seen, and therefore they are the rare ones. But it's not a question, not just about what I haven't seen. It's a question of what some of my dealer friends have never seen, who's I value their view enormously, of course.
Well, I've spent well, as we talked last week, a couple of weeks looking for a print that nobody's seen of a Grand National winner by a rare or an artist who comes from Wolverhampton. So there are prints out there we think we know exist, but
is that the Bouvet one?
Yes, yeah. A question from America. Karen Paddick has asked about collecting prints. How do you keep your prints? And protect them from the light and all the other things we have to worry about.
Well, of course, you know what they say, the safest place for a print is on the wall. And rumor has it that burglars don't nick them either because they're only prints. I keep a lot of them in racks, sort of 1 foot apart, and probably I can get about 5 or 6 in between. And I have a room dedicated to just my collection, which I keep at a sort of proper control. That's for the framed ones, and then the little ones, the sort of earlier ones of George Hunt and so on, I keep in a box, and I air them from time to time. I open the box and I look through them, and I know them all, but I just enjoy having a look at them. And it's funny what you notice when you take another look at a print, and what else? The light. Yes, I try very hard not to expose them to light. I mean, sunlight does affect prints, so I try and keep them in sort of corridors and so on. My wife forbids them in certain rooms in the house, so that helps.
You're not living in darkness, though.
I'm not living in dark. But our staircase, the house we used to live in, the house we do live in, has a big staircase, and I can get amazing how many prints you can get on a staircase. And that's relatively dark, unless, of course, the wife and children have been in and left the lights on. But so no, I mean, sunlight is very destructive, and you've just got to be careful. Yeah.
The question from Liz Mariner, I think you might know, has the book from the launch, but looking for a copy of the slides that you've used today. Is it possible to get access to them, or is it something that she should ask Sally and she'll pass on the message to you? I
think that's probably the best thing. Yes, I mean, I just ask you, please don't go through Amazon, because they are, I can't think of a polite word, but I mean, you end up getting pennies. Well, if you could, I think it worked out. I get about £6 or something, and given that it's cost considerably more than that, it is a bit of a kick in the butt.
It was a bit more about the slides that you've used today. I think that's what she was asking about. Is it something that she should go through Sally or to you direct?
All the slides today came out of our book.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, all in the book, and of course, about 450 more as well.
I've also got a note here from Peter Johnson.
I mean, we can send it to Liz Mariner. We can be in contact. Yeah.
Okay. A question from, or a comment from Peter Johnson, who you must have dealt with over the years.
Yep, rather.
Our grandmother was a Hunt, or a Buller Hunt, and as children we knew her Aunt Dorothy and her daughter Celia. Their family name was Pollard, and the engravers, so she's making the point that the engravers and the artists did mix.
Yeah.
they didn't live in totally separate worlds and were obviously intermarrying or.
Well, I'll tell you something, this is really rather funny because I didn't know this, but I can tell you that Buller, Hunt, Aunt Dorothy, I mean, my grandmother was Dorothy, well, actually, she didn't have a daughter, Celia, but Celia is a family name, and Pollard is another family name, and I can't believe there isn't a relationship there somewhere, you know. And on the question of Buller, I think my mother, who was well and truly a Hunt because both her parents were Hunts from different sides, she used to believe that we were married to a General Buller, but we never were able to prove that. I mean, there's still with all these chaps of the past. I mean, there's so much yet to be learned, and the fun is just tinkering away if you've got the time. And it's amazing what you see. This has turned up something that I find quite interesting. Who knows where it leads to?
Right. I think those are the questions that we've had and the ones that I've added. John, I'd like to thank you for your time today.
You're very welcome.
It's much appreciated, and I think we've all learned the enthusiasm with which you tackled your 600-page book. It obviously never palled as you were those hours you have to spend in correcting and looking at proofs and finding prints, and you've always retained the enthusiasm, and that comes across.
I'm reminded of a saying of Beethoven. He said, to make a few mistakes is understandable, but to play without enthusiasm is unforgivable. Enthusiasm gets you everywhere.
Thank you very much. And if anybody's got any follow-up questions or points, please put them through Sally at the normal BSAT address, and I'm sure John will be able to answer them.
Oh, I'll try my best. Yeah, lovely.
Thank you for that.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for your patience in listening.
And thank you for wrestling with the technology, and thank you, Spider, for your help.
She was the one. She was the one. Here she is. Because she's going to go on, show yourself now.
I have to say that we've had a really good audience today.
Oh, good. Have they all disappeared?
No, we've still got 47 people.
Oh, gee.
In there. But we went up to 60, John, which was very good.
Right. Can I just make the next lecture is on the 16th of February, again at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Our speaker will be Chris Stride, who's entitled his lecture From Pitch to Plinth. From Pitch to Plinth. Chris has been studying all the public works in sculpture, and particularly the new sporting art that's appearing on the walls of our towns and cities, both human and equine. And it's the celebration of those sporting heroes in new form. So that's on the 16th of February at 2 o'clock. And again, like to thank John this morning or this afternoon for all the work and effort that's been put into making this talk such a success. So thank you for that, John. It's much appreciated.
Yeah, well, I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.